Hey everybody, I want to welcome you guys to another episode of The Loop. Today we have some very special guests in the studio with us. We've got Miss Sarah, Miss Janice, and Miss Cece, and I'm going to be talking to them about one of the more controversial subjects in the entire Bible. And so it's going to be a great episode. Ladies, thank you for joining me. This is not a surprise. You know what we're talking about, but I want to start with a question just to kind of get the ball rolling, okay? In fact, it's a two-part question, and I want each one of you to answer it. And so, Cece, we're going to start with you, okay? When you hear the word submission, how does that word make you feel? Let's just start there. And you can just say one or two words, or you can go on a diatribe if you want and really unpack it, whatever you feel comfortable with.
Well, I will say submission for me is a choice. It's my willingness to do something, my willingness to offer my time, my attention, my support. So it's my choice to do something that is necessary to better a situation.
And that's wonderful. That's a great perspective. All right, Miss Janice, how about you? When you hear the word submission, how does it make you feel?
It makes me question. The first question it makes me ask is, who am I supposed to be submitting to?
Okay.
And what kind of character does that person have?
That's great. That's great. All right, Sarah, you're up. When you hear that word, that's such a controversial word, how does it typically make you feel?
To me, I immediately think of like my control and if I'm losing it, and then if my opinion matters.
But we all know women in the world who they hear the word submission and they cringe. There are some women who hear the word submission and they even kind of bow up on the idea of submitting to their husbands. Why do you think so many women might feel that way when they hear that word?
I'll speak to that.
Yeah.
I think when I said earlier about control is I think so many women value control, and our independence is so important in this culture. I think it also, submission involves a lot of trust. And if we're talking about submitting to our husbands, maybe their husbands are not trustworthy.
That's huge. You know, I was listening to Miss Janice earlier and she commented, you know, when I hear the word submit, I want to know, who do I have to submit to? And it sounds very similar to what I hear you saying is there's this tension because if the person's not trustworthy, man, I don't want to be under their control. That's great. Any other reasons why you think women may cringe or bow up on the idea of submitting to their husbands?
Well, I think we live in such a world of hearing so many things about abuse and men who want to be so dominant and force you into things you don't want to do, that a lot of people, if they're not exposed to fine Christian men, they may question, how in the world can I submit to some of these people I'm hearing about?
Wow. Yeah, that's great. Cece, anything you want to add, or you feel like they got it?
I mean, it's been covered, but submission in our culture sometimes sounds like a force. It takes away a woman's ability to choose or decide for herself what is done. And therefore, I think our culture somewhat takes it out of context.
That's great. Yeah. How long have you been married to Greg?
10 years.
Okay, 10 years minimum of experience sitting at the table. Miss Janice, how long have you and Mr. Larry been married?
55 years this year.
55 years this year. That deserves a round of applause. That's amazing. Cece, how long have you and Shante been married?
21 years.
21 years. And so collectively, we've got over 85 years of marriage experience sitting at the table. So as you kind of think back over your own marriage and you watch the way submission has played out, how has submitting to your husband positively impacted your family? Cece, let's start with you.
Well, for me, I think Sarah touched on what I think it does. It has built trust in my relationship with my husband. And even though I am a very strong-willed woman,
yes,
my ability to just trust that he can make decisions for our family, and his ability to kind of feel, the reaction to making decisions, and they're good decisions. It builds up our family. It creates stability that we need, with balance.
That's great. I'm going to tell you right now, one of the things that men crave in the marriage relationship is respect. And so when you talk like that, what it says to me is, oh, your husband feels respected when you so value his opinion that you're willing to say, I trust you to make the right call for our family. Now, men are not perfect. A lot of men get it wrong, but it really does a lot for them as the leader of the family when their wife respects their opinion in that way. How has submission played out in a positive way in your family?
Echoing what Cece said, I feel like it's built trust, but when I submit, it doesn't mean that we don't have a conversation. It doesn't mean that my opinion is not heard or valid.
Yes.
But I think it's just ultimately a posture of my heart and what God has designed. So like you said earlier, of like me submitting to Greg lets him feel respect and lets him feel loved, and therefore lets him lead well, I feel like. So I think it's an issue of not like choosing my pride and choosing unity over that. And so I think that's brought peace to our home.
That's powerful. And I think that's something a lot of men need to hear, is that submission does not mean we make decisions in isolation.
Yeah. So this is it, and no discussion.
No. The truth is every man needs a great woman in their life. In fact, there's an old joke that says behind every great man is a great woman who's rolling her eyes in disbelief, right? And so it's this joke like, yeah, man, like a woman needs to be able to speak in. And the reason why is because she has a completely different perspective. And it's really important that you work together as a team. You process the decision, gather as much information as possible. And then, yeah, you got to go somebody's got to make the decision, but not in isolation from their spouse. Yeah, that's great. Anything else, Miss Janice, in terms of how submission being played out in your family has affected your family in a positive way?
Well, I have a great situation with a husband who makes wise decisions, but like Cece, I'm strong-willed and I have an opinion about everything, and I'm able to voice that opinion about everything. But if we come to a stalemate, Larry's the tiebreaker.
Yeah.
It's his decision and his opinion, and for us, that's worked perfectly well. It creates a sense of peace and a sense of knowing that I can trust he's going to do what's best, even if it may not be what I want right that minute.
Yeah. And so as I'm listening to you ladies, I know your husbands. I have a tremendous amount of respect, not just for you ladies, but also for the husbands that you're married to. But I know they're not perfect. And I'm thinking about all the ladies out there who are listening on, well, yeah, if I was married to a Larry Pitchford or a Greg Marble or Shante Ballard, like, yeah, it'd be easy. What do I do? And so talk to me, because I know your husbands aren't perfect. Talk to me about how submission being played out in your family has actually affected your family in a negative way.
Oh, gosh, I've prepared for this question the reverse way, like of me not submitting. So I can speak to that first.
Go for it. Yeah.
Because I have not always been a submissive wife, and I still don't do it perfectly. But I know in one way, most relationships, someone's a spender and someone's a saver, and I'm the spender in our relationship. And there have been times where Greg and I have had disagreements about how we should spend our money. And that's been hard for me, and a lot of like pushback over the past. And that's caused disagreement and not having peace, not having unity in our home. And ultimately the Lord not blessing that either. So I've seen the reverse of that. And then me slowly, trying to succumb to Greg's wishes for that and the Lord's plans, and see him bless us in that way, have me submitting. So, but I don't know if I
think that's exactly what I anticipated, is because I think the struggle with submission is sometimes we don't do it.
Yeah.
And then it ends up negatively affecting our family, or maybe our marriage, or maybe financially. I mean, finances is the number one thing that couples fight about. So you're not alone. Take comfort in that. But that's a real struggle. And there are a lot of people on the podcast who are resonating with what you're saying simply because of that issue. It's so hard.
It's I have to ask the Lord to check my heart on that, because it's not as easy of just I just respect my husband so much and I'm just going to do everything he wishes. But it's it's hard. I want to do this or buy that. But I'm no, Lord, help me to be unified. I think that's my constant prayer of when Greg and I I have big decisions or things that I ask for unity, and that it may not happen right away, but like what you said, Larry's the tiebreaker, and like ultimately, Greg's the tiebreaker in our home. But I pray that with these big things that the Lord, if it's his will, that the Lord changes my heart for that.
Yeah. Well, the passage that we're in is the book of Ephesians. It's chapter 5. And in that passage, the Apostle Paul says that we should submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. And so I want to just remind all the fellas that passage does tell us to submit to one another. This is not a one-way street. This is actually a two-way street. But the emphasis I want you to talk about is that phrase, out of reverence for Christ. And so how does that help you submit to your husband when you think about submitting out of reverence for Jesus rather than submitting out of reverence for Greg, Larry, or Shante? Talk about that.
I think that's the only way we really submit long term. I mean, we can all sit here around this table and think how easy it is to do it and how great our husbands are, but it's only because of Christ that we're able to give up sometimes our way and what we want. It's only because of him that we can do that.
Well, and that's what I loved about what Sarah was saying. Sometimes I have to check my heart. Sometimes I struggle with pride. Sometimes I want to be in control. That's human nature. But when we bring Jesus into the equation and we start going, okay, like this isn't just about doing something that honors my husband. This is about conducting myself in a way that brings honor to Christ. That's a game changer.
Yeah. When you think about it, like every year our church does the journey to the cross, and I'm just I'm pulled emotionally at everything Jesus went through to sacrifice his life and to pour into the world and to save the world.
Yeah.
When I think about that as it relates to marriage, it makes submission so much easier. I'm like, if Jesus did this for humankind, like how simple is it to just ask of me to submit to my husband,
not spend $100 on whatever. Okay. Right. Like but that's a beautiful picture of submission that Jesus had to say, I'm going to set aside my will for the Father's will. And I think, a lot of times I don't think women are thinking about, man, I'm trying to follow Jesus as the leader of my life. What does that look like in terms of submitting to your husband? Well, Jesus gave us a great example of what it looks like to submit in the toughest time. And if he can submit in that moment of his life, then it probably does make it a little easier for us to submit to one another in the more petty things in our lives.
Well, yeah, like we don't deserve it. We don't deserve Jesus's grace that he gave us. And oftentimes maybe our husbands don't deserve to be submitted to, but
Did I hear an amen out there? No, keep going.
Yeah, but it's we're not, like, as we're submitting to our husbands, we're ultimately submitting to Christ. And so I think if we're just remembering that it's more out of reverence to Christ than it is to our husband, I think that makes it easier. Yeah. Especially, I know I said only 10 years in, there's been times where I've submitted and it's been like, oh, like we probably should have made this decision or vice versa. But there's grace in that. And it's just the way God designed it,
100%. And I think I want to encourage the ladies that when you bring Jesus into the equation and you submit out of reverence for Christ, I want you to believe that if you honor Christ, Christ will honor you.
Yeah, he sees that.
He sees that. And there is a blessing on your life because he knows that it's hard. He's experienced how tough it can be to sacrifice your own will for the Father's will. And so I absolutely believe that when we honor Christ, he honors us in return. Let me ask you this question. Paul said that wives should submit to their husbands in, it's the most difficult word on the planet, everything. Okay. Wives should submit to their husbands in everything. What would you say to women who say, I'm willing to submit to my husband in some things, or maybe even a lot of things, but not everything? What would you say?
To take a look at yourself and why is that? Is it their leadership or is it your heart? Is it your pride? I keep coming back to the finances because that's where I struggle. I struggle with my flesh in that. And so it's like, am I not willing to do this because I selfishly want to buy these things, spend that money, whatever. So I know for me, it's a matter of pride and a heart check for myself.
That's great.
And that advice to look at yourself and decide, why is it hard to submit in these areas? And maybe that's a conversation you have to have with your husband, that I'm really finding it difficult to submit in this situation. Help me understand why.
That's
And I mean, we all have situations that it's hard for us we battle submission.
yeah.
And it's, you hear a lot of kids, younger people, younger women, just not sold on this idea at all. I'm not going to submit to some man. And so my advice for years has been, you better not marry anybody that you are not willing to submit to, like the Lord has advised you to, told you to in the Bible. So you're still out there and you've got a choice to make.
For all those single ladies who are sitting there going, man, I'm thinking about marrying this dude. If you can't submit to him, you do not want to marry him.
Don't do it.
That is incredibly wise. Cece, anything you want to add?
I mean, when you stand before God and the pastor and all those people on that day that you share your vows with your spouse and the world, you're saying, I'm willing to submit. I'm willing to share my life with you, which means in some ways having to listen, having to give up some of your own selfish needs and desires. And I do agree, a heart check is constantly needed. And I think some women don't understand. They think that you'll have that same feeling that you had at the beginnings of the marriage all throughout.
I'll do anything for you.
Right. And in reality, there are going to be circumstances that lead you to question or different things like that. But what I see in my own marriage is it's security that I'm seeking. And as long as my husband can respond to me and make me feel secure, then I'm willing to lead, or not lead, excuse me, edit that. I'm willing to follow his lead and guidance in any situation.
100%. And I think that's such an important point because, when Paul says submit in everything, obviously he has an expectation that the husband is acting as a man of God and never asking his wife to do anything that is sinful. He would never ask his wife to do anything that is not good for their family. And so I think that is a really important point, that Paul is operating off of an assumption. And the assumption is that husband is going to love his wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, not asking her to do things that would be outside of God's will for her life or for their family. And so such an important point for us to make there. Let me ask you this. How do you handle situations where you strongly disagree with the direction that your husband wants to go? How do you handle that?
Well, I'll say I'm a very logical person. I don't think that we all think alike, nor will my husband take the same steps that I would take to resolve an issue. But in our discussions, if he can explain to me his rationale, whether it would be the way that I would do it or not, I typically support his rationale, and he listens to me. He respects me, and will even come to me for input and feedback. So that helps with my ability to just trust that he's making a decision in the best interest of our family.
That's great. Anything, Ms.
Well,
Janice?
one thing about that is if they do make a decision that we're against, but we get down to the wire and they still make that decision, one way we respect them the most is that we don't say, see, I told you not to do that. So sometimes submission means keeping your mouth shut.
Yeah, there you go. Because it's tempting in those moments where they make the wrong call, because they will make the wrong call. And there are going to be times where they just get it wrong because they're not Jesus. They're just ordinary human beings, and we don't always get it right. That's great. Sarah, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think you ladies said it, but I think it's just respect, and that we talk about it. But ultimately, if it's something that I don't feel led to, I just ask for the Lord to change my heart in that. Because sometimes Greg will say, hey, I'm thinking this. And I'm like, well, the Lord hasn't told me that yet. So I'm like, Lord, if this is what you want, I want to be unified with my husband in this. So change my heart.
Well, and I think, you're talking about something that's an essential ingredient here, and that's prayer. So I hear you talking to God as the leader of the family who's getting ready to make this decision. Men, I need to know that you've been talking to God too.
Yes.
That this isn't what you want to do. This is you seeking God and going, okay, God, what do you want us to do as a family? I'm willing to make the tough call, even if my wife disagrees, but I got to hear from you and I got to know this isn't my will. This really is God's will. This isn't what is best for me. This really is what's best for my family. And I think that if a wife knows my husband has been talking to God, what I hear you ladies saying, if my husband has been talking to me, and if my husband has been listening to me, then I can trust the decision, even if I don't agree with it.
Yes.
But it's when, I don't know if you've been praying about it. I know you haven't been listening to my opinion. You haven't been explaining your rationale or your way of thinking on this issue. That's when it's really, really hard. And so, man, make sure you're talking to God, you're explaining your reasoning or rationale, and that you are listening to your spouse. That, just for the record, God calls your helpmate. So do not forget that. Number 7, last question I want to ask you is, what would you say to women who have a husband who is not submitting to Christ? Do they still have to submit to their husbands?
You mentioned this earlier, but I think yes, unfortunately. But if it's an issue of abuse or sin, then no. You know, like if your husband is hurting you or doing anything, like, God forbid, but that's not what Paul is talking to. This is not an excuse for abuse, whether it be sexually, physically, emotionally, verbally, none of that. That's not what Peter's talking about. That's not what God's talking about. But it also says in 1 Peter 3 that, yes, we are supposed to submit, and that even by our actions, we can be a witness to our husbands through our submission, whether they deserve it or not.
That's right.
That's right.
Wow.
That's
That's
exactly
powerful.
right.
Sometimes as women, we can model God's love, to one another, and that be what saves our husbands, souls.
I have counseled with many women, and I said, I think you are the link that has the greatest shot at getting them into heaven with God. That the way you're conducting yourself, I know you're frustrated with him. I know you want to kill him. I know you don't want to listen to him or much less submit to him. But man, the way you're conducting yourself could be an eternal difference, not just an earthly difference. And I think women have to remember that when they're married to someone who is not submitting to Christ, there's something much bigger and much more eternal that's at stake than just these earthly temporary decisions. Miss Janice, anything you want to add on that?
Well, I think if we have a woman who's married to an unbeliever, the first thing is that we still encourage them to submit to Christ in all things. Submit to Christ. Submit to this man that you were married to and that you love in every way you can, but don't ever let it be against your faith in God. Don't ever let it harm you or harm your children or your family.
That's right.
But in exactly what Cece said, your way, the way you live before him, can be the thing that draws him to Christ.
It's powerful. Well, ladies, thank you so much. I know it's a lot easier for women to hear it from you than it is from me. And so I really appreciate the wisdom, the thought, and just the way you conduct your families. It really is a great example for our church and our community. So thank you for all you do. Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Loop. You can send all of your critical emails to Jeremy at jeremy.hall@mosaicgc.com. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.